Good afternoon. I'm Lester Jackson, State Senator from Chatham County. Also, I serve as chairman of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. And today, I'm happy to stand here with the leadership of the AME Church as we talk about progressive ideas that lead Georgia forward. The Georgia Legislative Black Caucus is proud to carry the work of the church to the State House. The AME Church has been a leader of providing leadership for the members of not only of its church members, but the citizens of this great state. The Georgia Legislative Black Caucus stands on the right side when it comes to equality, when it comes to justice, when it comes to fairness. Today we're going to talk about hate crime and many other issues that affects this great state. We know that 45 states in this great nation have some sort of hate crime legislation, and Georgia does not. And today, the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus stand with the AME Church and many other church affiliates across this great state to introduce legislation, to pass legislation that affects hate crime. At this time, I will introduce to you the Bishop of the AME Church, Bishop Reginald Jackson.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. Today, African American faith leaders from across the state of Georgia gather here at the State House with members of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus to address issues that are important to our congregants, our constituents, and communities across the state. These issues may not be important to many in these legislative chambers. Those who don't face the likelihood of hate crimes, those who make a living wage, and those minority businesses who face the impossible task of seeking to do business with the state of Georgia. As faith leaders, the people of color who too often have no one to speak for them, we stand today on their behalf so the voices can be heard and these important issues can be addressed. The issues we address today are not all of the issues. We intend to return to this State House to address the issue of quality education. This may be the most important issue to people of color in this state, and we will present specifics to be considered. But today we address the issues of hate crimes, the minimum wage, and state contracts. A few weeks ago, 2 hate crimes bills were introduced in the legislature. One by Representative Megan Hansen, a Republican, and another by members of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. Georgia is one of only 5 states in the nation which does not have a hate crimes law. We believe it is important that the state legislature pass and the governor sign hate crimes legislation, but not just any legislation. It ought to be the best and the strongest hate crimes legislation that can be passed. We believe that is House Bill 663, sponsored by the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. We call upon Representative Hansen to meet with members of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus to come up with one strong piece of legislation that has language which will make the law effective, that can win strong bipartisan support. We also call upon the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus to support this effort. We also call upon the Georgia State Legislature to support legislation which increases the state minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. The minimum wage in Georgia is $5.15. A person working 40 hours a week in Georgia, earning the minimum wage, receives $210 a week, or about $850 a month. This is not a wage they can live on. Georgia and Wyoming are the only states in the nation that are substantially below the federal minimum wage. Our state leaders talk often about improving the quality of life of all of the citizens of Georgia. Yet we do little or nothing to increase the income of those who are on the bottom of the income scale. We call upon the state legislature to pass legislation increasing the state minimum wage. While we would like to see an increase in one step from $5.15 to $15, we realize this may be difficult to do. So we could support integral increases which leads to $15 an hour. This would mean $600 a week for a 40-hour work week and $2,400 a month, which would be a livable wage, enough to live off. House Bill 315 calls for an immediate increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This legislation provides the foundation for a good discussion and debate. This discussion and debate must be held. The current minimum wage of $5.15 an hour cannot remain. It needs to be changed. It ought to be changed. It must be changed. We will do all that we can to see that it is changed. There's also an urgent need to address state contracts that go to minority businesses. Georgia's record regarding this matter is absolutely abysmal. Blacks make up 33% of the state's population, but receive less than 3% of the state's contracts. There is no acceptable explanation for this. The fact is, this is not important to the state, not something that the state has prioritized. We demand that the state make it a priority. Representative Roger Bruce has introduced House Bill 21, which calls for steps to be put in place to address this issue. We urge the state legislature to pass this bill, but for this issue to be resolved, will require more than words on paper. It will require commitment and oversight. These three issues, hate crimes legislation, increasing the minimum wage, and state contracts, all require support from legislative leaders and the governor. If legislative leaders and the governor support legislation on these issues, they will pass. We have sought, through the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus, to arrange meetings with the governor, lieutenant governor, and House Speaker to discuss these issues. We have been informed that so far the governor's office and the speaker's office have not responded. The lieutenant governor has offered to have us meet with one of his policy advisors. This is totally unacceptable. We have sent letters today from faith leaders to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, and to the speaker, requesting a meeting on these issues. Additionally, I will contact each of their offices personally to request a meeting. We know this is an election year, and people do peculiar things in an election year. And there's some things we don't want to talk about in an election year. But leadership requires that leaders speak to matters that are important to the people they seek to lead. We remind our leaders, all of whom profess to be people of faith, we call upon them to do what the Bible calls for. We simply say to them, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, "Come." and let us reason together.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Any questions for any of these saints?
Is there any one particular incident that sparked the desire to have stronger hate crimes legislation?
First of all, the national environment, which is troublesome. We're living in a time now where hate crimes, violence, and racism all across the country are increasing. But also the dilemma here in Georgia is because there is no law which defines hate crime, what do you call it? For example, we have one of our own churches here in Fort Valley, Georgia, which on at least 3 different occasions, while events have been going on, somebody has poured oil around the church and slashed tires. And that has been reported to the police, but there has been no action. We have another church in the southern part of the state where at least 3 or 4 times that church has been vandalized with, in fact, racist marks left behind. And again, there has been no response from law enforcement. And so when I read articles that say there is no increase in hate crimes, my response is, how do you know? Because there is nothing in Georgia which defines what a hate crime is. And before I go further, let me call on the dean of the legislature in Georgia, Representative Calvin Smyrie, to give some remarks.
Thank you very much, Bishop Jackson. I want to thank our chair, Senator Jackson, and all the members that are here assembled here today. And we joined the African American Episcopal Church and the AME Church in supporting these ideas. It's nothing new about a livable wage. We've been talking about that for many, many years, and about contracts and making sure that we get a functional share of our goods and services at our Department of Transportation and other state agencies. But the new thing on the horizon, it's not new, but it's new to Georgia, and that's hate crimes. And we stand with the bishop and the members of the clergy here assembled today. Hate crime is something that has been on the political horizon, but it's just not been dealt with in the state of Georgia. And high times that we do it. 2 bills have been introduced, and I agree with the bishop that we should come together in a very bipartisan fashion and come up with something that's strong and effective here in the state of Georgia. And we look forward to working with the members of the clergy that are present here today and members of the House and Senate to make sure that we accomplish that.
Yes.
Do you have any information on how the penalties would change under a hate crime versus, let's say, a federal crime that currently exists?
The legislation, which is sponsored by Leaders Representative Hansen, right now says that in order to be charged with a hate crime, you first have to be convicted of another crime, which our concern is that, again, almost makes hate crime legislation non-existent, because somebody may, in fact, commit something which if there was some definition of a hate crime, you could be indicted on itself. But under that legislation, you first have to be convicted of something else, then you get indicted for the hate crime. We believe a hate crime ought to speak for itself, and that the consequence of it ought to be tough and ought to have some pain, which will prohibit folk from wretched thinking.
The author of the hate crime legislation is State Representative Karen Bennett, and there's an accompanying Senate bill also that reads the same. Right now, I'd like to introduce State Representative Karen Bennett to talk about her specific hate crime legislation. She's the author, but also it's been co-sponsored by several members of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Bishop Jackson. Under House Bill 663, when it's determined that the aggravated assault and battery, if there can be proven that it was maliciously done or committed with hate as the reason for committing the crime, there carries an automatic increase in sentencing. So as Bishop Jackson did say, we want the entire Georgia to understand and realize that when you maliciously and viciously commit a violent hate crime targeted at specific groups of people for none other than hate, that there will be additional penalties incurred.
Do we have a frame of reference as to how much higher, like minimum 10 years? or
3 to 5 years, beginning with aggravated assault and battery. And it does go up with the offense.
So minimum extra 3 to 5 years for
Minimum
aggravated
would
assault
be
and-
3 to 5 and 3 to 20, depending on the crime.
Okay, any other questions?
These three issues, hate crime, increasing the minimum wage, and inclusion of African American businesses are the three issues that the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus will stand for and move toward this legislative year, as also addressing public education. These issues will move Georgia in a progressive movement forward. If there's no more questions, I'll thank everyone for attending, and this concludes the press conference. Thank you.
Thank you.